Henry VIII. The name itself brings up a very specific image, doesn't it? A big, powerful king, maybe holding a turkey leg, with a string of wives who met rather unfortunate ends. He's one of history's most famous, or maybe infamous, monarchs. But was he just a tyrant obsessed with getting a son? Or is there more to the story? Let's dive into the dramatic, turbulent, and game-changing reign of Henry VIII. When Henry took the throne in 1509, he was the total opposite of the grumpy old king we often picture. He was young, just 17 years old, handsome, athletic, and incredibly charming. He was the Renaissance prince everyone had been waiting for. He loved hunting, jousting, music, and poetry. He was even a talented composer himself. England was buzzing with excitement. This new king was seen as a breath of fresh air after his father, Henry VII, who was known for being a bit, well, thrifty and serious. Almost immediately, Henry did something his father had arranged but never finalized. He married Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was the widow of his older brother, Arthur. This was a huge deal. Marrying your brother's widow required special permission from the Pope, which they got. They were deeply in love, and Henry trusted her as a political advisor. She even ruled as regent while he was off fighting in France. Catherine had multiple pregnancies, but only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary. In the 16th century, this was a massive issue. The Tudor dynasty was new, having won the throne in the Wars of the Roses. Without a son, Henry feared a return to civil war after his death. A female ruler was almost unheard of and considered a huge risk. As the years went by, Henry's anxiety grew into an obsession. He started to believe his marriage was cursed. He found a passage in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, that says a man who marries his brother's wife will be childless. He convinced himself that this was the reason God was punishing him. And conveniently, around this time, a new woman caught his eye. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't like the other ladies at court. She was witty, ambitious, and had spent time in the sophisticated French court. She wasn't content to be just another royal mistress. When Henry pursued her, she refused, insisting she would only be his wife and queen. This was a bold move, but it worked. Henry became completely infatuated. Now Henry had a dual mission: get rid of Catherine and marry Anne. The only person who could grant him an annulment was the Pope. But there was a big problem. The Pope was essentially a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. There was no way the Pope would anger the most powerful man in Europe to do Henry a favor. For years, Henry's best minds, including the brilliant Cardinal Wolsey, tried to negotiate with Rome, but they got nowhere. Wolsey's failure cost him everything, and he fell from power in disgrace. Henry was getting desperate. He needed a solution, and a group of radical religious thinkers, inspired by Martin Luther's Reformation in Germany, offered him one. They told him, "You're the king. Why are you listening to the Pope in Rome? You should be the head of the church in your own country." This was a revolutionary idea, but it was exactly what Henry wanted to hear. So, in a series of groundbreaking acts of parliament, Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This was the English Reformation. It wasn't really born out of deep religious conviction for Henry, at least not at first. It was a political move, a power grab driven by his desire for an annulment and a male heir. With his new power, he had his marriage to Catherine declared void, and, in 1533, he secretly married a pregnant Anne Boleyn. Catherine was cast aside, stripped of her title as queen, and separated from her daughter Mary. She was sent to live in gloomy, isolated castles until her death, never accepting the annulment, and always considering herself Henry's true wife. It was a cruel end for a loyal queen of over 20 years. Finally, Henry had what he wanted. Anne was his queen, and she was pregnant. The entire kingdom held its breath, waiting for the birth of a prince. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. You can imagine Henry's crushing disappointment. He had torn his kingdom apart, defied the Pope, and for what? Another daughter. Anne's position was now incredibly fragile. She had promised Henry a son, and she failed to deliver. A couple of miscarriages later, Henry's infatuation had turned to frustration and then to cold anger. His eye had already started to wander again, this time to a quiet, gentle lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. To get rid of Anne, Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, cooked up a series of shocking charges against her. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, and even of plotting to kill the king. These charges were almost certainly fabricated, but a terrified court found her guilty. In May 1536, just 3 years after becoming queen, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on the Tower Green. It was a brutal and shocking end to a woman who had changed the course of English history. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane was everything Anne wasn't: meek, obedient, and gentle. And, most importantly, in 1537, she did what 2 queens before her could not. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Edward Henry was ecstatic. He finally had his heir. He had secured his dynasty. But his joy was short-lived. Just a few days after the birth, Jane died from complications. Henry was genuinely heartbroken. He considered Jane his only true wife and commanded that he be buried next to her when he died. With his heir secured, Henry's reign entered a new, even more brutal phase. The break with Rome had given him immense power, but also created huge religious divisions in the country. To fill his empty treasury and cement his authority, Henry, with Cromwell's help, began the dissolution of the monasteries. Over the next few years, hundreds of monasteries and convents, which had been part of English life for centuries, were closed down. Their immense wealth, land, and treasures were seized by the crown. This act of cultural vandalism was met with resistance, most notably the Pilgrimage of Grace, a huge uprising in the north of England. Henry's response was ruthless. He crushed the rebellion and executed its leaders, showing that any opposition to his will would be met with force. After Jane's death, Henry remained a widower for a couple of years. But politics demanded another marriage. Thomas Cromwell, trying to forge an alliance with Protestant princes in Germany, arranged a match with Anne of Cleves. Cromwell showed Henry a very flattering portrait of her, painted by the famous artist Hans Holbein. But when Anne arrived in England, Henry was horrified. He found her plain and famously called her the Flanders mare. The marriage was a disaster from the start and was annulled after just 6 months. This failure cost Thomas Cromwell his head. Henry had turned on another loyal servant. Next up was wife number 5, Catherine Howard. She was a young, vivacious teenager, a cousin of Anne Boleyn. Henry, now in his late 40s, overweight and suffering from a painful leg ulcer, was completely smitten with his rose without a thorn. But Catherine was young and foolish. She was careless and began an affair with a man at court. When her past indiscretions and her current affair were revealed to the king, his rage was terrifying. Feeling betrayed and made a fool of, he had her executed for treason in 1542. She was barely out of her teens. Henry's final wife was Catherine Parr. She was a mature, kind widow who was more of a companion and nurse to the aging, increasingly ill king. She was also a good stepmother to Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and helped to bring them back into the king's favor. Catherine Parr was a reformer at heart and navigated the dangerous court politics skillfully, even surviving a plot by her enemies to have her arrested for heresy. She outlived Henry, who died in 1547. So, how do we remember Henry VIII tyrant? Visionary? Monster? He was all of these things. He was a man of huge appetites and even bigger contradictions, a lover of music and learning who ordered the execution of his friends and wives, a devout man who tore down the church for personal gain. His quest for a male heir led to the English Reformation, a moment that fundamentally changed England's religion, culture, and identity forever. He left behind a powerful navy, a stronger monarchy, and a religiously divided nation. But perhaps his greatest legacy was his children, the sickly Edward, the Catholic Bloody Mary, and, most famously, the Protestant Elizabeth I, a daughter he never wanted, who would go on to become one of England's greatest ever monarchs. The story of Henry VIII is a whirlwind of love, betrayal, and power. It shows how the personal desires of one man could reshape a nation. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into Tudor history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.